Chapter 6, Week 6, are there problems surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection? What we're doing this evening, and if you're following along the book, this is starting on page 92, we are building along the same type of theme that we talked about last week, where the first 4 weeks we were talking about particular moral issues that people raise with the Bible, and then these last 2 weeks we're kind of focusing on alleged contradictions. People see difficulties between two passages, thinks that they don't line up in one way or another, specifically when the same story is told in multiple Gospels or multiple books. It can occur in the Old Testament too, but again, for time and just for illustration purposes, we focused last week on stories that concern Jesus' birth, and this week we're focusing on stories surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. But the principles that we're applying here can be applied wherever you come across these contradictions, and that's really ultimately the point. This class is not meant to be an exhaustive list of every single objection anybody has ever made to the Bible. More than anything, it's designed to give you the tools to know how to confront these issues when they come up. So as we've been doing, we're going to start out with a brief review of what our basic principles are. We've covered them all 6 so far in this class. Now we're just going to be applying them more to the death and resurrection narratives. Basic principle number 1, even labeling an act as immoral in the first place requires God to be the source of all that is good. Principle number 2, just because the Bible records an action does not mean God has condoned that action. Principle number 3, always make sure we take in the entire surrounding textual context before coming to a conclusion. Number 4, there are privileges reserved to God by nature of him being God. Number 5, sometimes our failure to understand a difficult passage is because we are missing some nuance from the original language or the historical cultural context in which the action takes place. And number 6, that we picked up on last week, a difference does not necessarily equal a contradiction. And what you'll see, and maybe you started to see last week, is sometimes more than one principle might apply to help you solve the issue. For example, like you'll see sometimes tonight, where we're going to be applying that 6th principle, where a difference does not necessarily equal a contradiction. And the reason we know that it's just a difference and not a contradiction is because we're looking at the historical cultural context or something like that. So there can be overlap between these, but they can help hopefully give you a sense of direction in knowing where to look when you're coming across one of these things. So tonight, I had to include this. I'm sure this is a very famous quote that people have probably heard before. It is very apropos for this particular lesson. It's from Benjamin Franklin, supposedly. I don't know if it's actually historically accurate or not, but it's traditionally attributed to Benjamin Franklin. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Well, according to Jesus Christ and his gospel, the only one of those that's actually certain is taxes. He took away the fear of death and the sting of death, according to what Christianity teaches through his death and his resurrection. But the question is that really true? And one of the objections people lodge to us claiming that is true is they point to alleged contradictions. So what we're going to do tonight is we are going to follow some of the same methods that we did last week in looking at the birth narratives, and we're going to look at some of the specific objections that are often raised concerning the death narratives and the resurrection narratives, starting with one of the most common ones. I don't know, you may have heard this one before. There's probably going to be some tonight you have heard and some you haven't. All right. This one you might have heard before. It's a reasonably common objection that's raised, and that is, how did Judas die? All right, and what we see, if we were to look at there are two versions of how Judas died, one in the Gospel of Matthew and one in the book of Acts. Anybody remember who wrote the book of Acts? Luke did, right. So it's the same author as who wrote the Gospel of Luke is now just continuing on to writing the book of Acts. So for all intents and purposes, it's like we have two different gospel narratives talking about how Judas died. We have definitely have two gospel authors, and supposedly they give different versions of how he died. In Matthew 27, verse 5, Matthew says this. He says, "So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself." But if we turn to Acts chapter 1, verse 18, it says, "With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out." So let's do what we always do, and let's face it head on. We don't want to dodge anything. We don't want to avoid any complications. Let's look at these two verses and say, what are the differences?
One he spent the money, and the other he saved it.
There's one. One talks about him actually spending the money. I guess that's what it looks like, right? Spending the money to buy a field. The other one doesn't do that. What else? Hanged himself versus body bursting open and intestines falling everywhere. Ew, by the way. So it's funny, you never see that. Even as graphic as the Passion of the Christ was, I don't think they showed Judas's intestines everywhere. Maybe I'm wrong. It's been a while since I've seen that movie because you can only take it so many times. But all right, so the question then becomes, are these differences or are these contradictions? You've identified the two main issues, and that's good. The issue about the money and about the mechanism of his death. All right, let's talk about the money first of all. First of all, did Judas actually buy a field? All right. Well, let me ask you a question. Let me listen. I didn't do a slide for this one. Acts chapter 1, verse 19. If this is right after, the very next verse, right after Luke narrates that Judas bought a field. All right. He then refers to it as becoming to be named the Field of Blood. It came to have that title, this field was called the Field of Blood. So the question is, does Luke mean that Judas literally paid the money and exchanged and bought a field? Because if he does mean that, that would seem to suggest that Judas lived at least long enough afterwards to purchase the field, right? That seems somewhat odd considering the book of Acts, one of the first orders of business that he's talking about is them getting a successor for Judas, and it seems to be a relatively quick thing. And so if Judas literally bought a field, when exactly did he do this? When exactly did he buy it? Let me give you a modern turn of phrase and see if you can define this one for me. Anybody ever heard the expression that someone bought the farm? What's it mean?
They died.
They died. Does it mean they literally purchased a farm? No, it does not. All right. Something similar is likely. Again, the Bible doesn't explicitly tell us, so we're not going. The purpose here is to say, are these definite contradictions? All right. As you saw last week, sometimes, Bill asked me a question. I said, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not going to have the answer to that. I've got some proposals what the answer might be, but what I do know is it's not a contradiction. As long as you can show there's a possible resolution, a possible harmonization, it's not a contradiction. All right, I may be right about the harmonization. I may be wrong. Maybe there's something else that explains it, but it's not a definite contradiction as long as you can reconcile them. Yeah?
But it says with the payment he received, he bought the field.
Well, meaning that with the money, there's a couple different explanations for that. Some people talk about it that's speaking figuratively in the sense that as a result of him getting this money, that's what led to his death. All right, because he received this payment, that's what led to his death. Other people talk about, well, maybe once he threw the money back to the priest, and the priest actually bought some land, and because that was bought with blood money, that's why it became known as the Field of Blood. Either one of those is possible. I tend to prefer the former myself, but those are both possible explanations.
Former, where you threw the money and they bought the field, that's what I always heard. Is that biblical or traditional?
It's possible. Let's just say that. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is the Bible doesn't, just like we saw some last week, the Bible doesn't explicitly say which of these is what actually happened. So it's always a mistake, and I got to say this is a problem that permeates the Christian church today, and I will speak out against it as much as possible, and that is taking these possibilities and making them dogmatic. In other words, getting the big arguments over, no, the priest bought the field. No, it's speaking figuratively, just like he bought the farm. And now all of a sudden we're going to break apart into separate denominations over whether or not Judas literally bought a field or figuratively bought a field, That's not what we should do. We always look to the scriptures themselves. Now, that is not to say that we can't learn things from the early church fathers, your second century Christians who were very much closer in time to Jesus than we are, and they do have a lot of very valuable teachings we can learn from, but even they aren't consistent in everything they teach, and the early church fathers are not the inspired word of God. It's only the Bible. So if the Bible doesn't specifically say which one it is, the answer is we don't want to be dogmatic about it. I don't know, but I can come up with a few possibilities which would illustrate that it's not a contradiction. So it could be that Luke in the book of Acts is speaking figuratively. Just like we say someone bought the farm, he bought the field. All right, and that's somewhat supported by the fact the field is then called the Field of Blood. Yeah.
I don't mean to antagonize you,
but you're going to anyway.
Does Luke, in his writings, ever report that somebody else bought a field when you died?
Does Luke ever? No, I don't think he ever uses that expression anywhere else. No, not to my knowledge. So it's let's say it's a possibility. All right, it certainly is enough to show that it's not necessarily a direct contradiction, especially when you look at the surrounding context. If you look at the book of Acts, very early on, Luke, same author now, is reporting how they have to find they're finding a successor. And if you look at the grand scheme of things, it doesn't read as if this is, 12 months later down the road. And so you start to ask the question, well, if he literally means that Judas purchased a field with that money, when exactly was Judas supposed to have done that? I mean, I guess it's theoretically possible. He could have, yay, Jesus is dead. Let me go buy some land, all right? But that also doesn't seem entirely consistent with what we know of Judas and his, shall we say, interest in money.
Of course, maybe he hung himself and the money was left over and somebody bought the field for him and buried him.
Maybe. Another possibility, especially when you consider the ways the Bible sometimes equates and skips generations when it's discussing things like that. Maybe Judas had some heir that bought the field with the money he had. I don't know. I tend to think it's speaking figuratively, but that's just me, and I'm not, but it's not a direct contradiction. But what about the way he died? What about the way he died? One of which says, Matthew says he hanged himself, and Judas says he fell headlong into a field. His body burst open and all his intestines spilled out. Is that a contradiction?
Yeah.
I'm hearing yes and no. All right, Bill, you say no. How would you reconcile those?
Very simple. He's hanging. He is pulled or falls down from the hanging, and when he hits the field,
there you go. He's hanging. And the other thing you got to keep in mind is the way Judas was not made of money. Obviously, he was made of intestines. Oh, no, that was not a good joke. I shouldn't have made that one. Judas he was not a wealthy man. And the way how would he have hanged himself? Well, he would have hanged himself by going to a tree with a rope. And what you do is you tie the rope around the tree branch, you tie the rope around your neck, you stand on the branch, and you jump off. All right. Now, that in of itself can cause someone the rope can break, the branch can break, or keep in mind, even if it didn't break right away, there was an earthquake soon after. All right. And that earthquake could have shaken it down and had him fall down. There's any number of ways. And there are plenty. We talked a few weeks ago about the geology of Israel versus the geology of Babylon when we were talking about, this might be all the way back in week 1 now that I think about it, where we talked about, the psalm that said something about, casting their babies against the rocks. We pointed out that there were no large rocks in Babylon. They did their construction out of mud bricks. Well, there were plenty of big rocks in Israel. All right, at the bottoms of fields, at the bottom of large drop-offs and everything like that. So yes, these are very easily reconcilable. He did hang himself. That's the answer. He hanged himself, fell from the tree, and fell onto the ground below. And to be honest, I'm an attorney. I was a criminal justice major. I've done a number of ride-alongs and had a number of cases. I can tell you, I've seen what happens to a body if it's been hanging, especially if it's been hanging for a while. And just to say it's entirely possible, even if he was hanging there for a while, that he then fell at some point and had his guts spill out. All right, that's not inconsistent at all. All right. Let's get into some of those that aren't quite as well known. And here's one. Let me ask you this before I turn to the next slide. What day of the week was Jesus crucified on? What's that? Friday. We always say Good Friday, right? We hear about that. Well, are you sure? And I will say there are some Christian denominations that actually do say it was Thursday, but most hold to the fact that it's being Friday. That's not directly our concern here as much as is there a contradiction in the Bible? All right. So the allegation here is that if you look at the different Gospels, they give you different dates of when Jesus was actually crucified. In order to understand this, you've got to understand a little bit of the historical background here. All right, some of this may be familiar to you. If it is, forgive me and bear with me for a minute. But way back when God rescued the Hebrews out of Egypt, all right, in the Exodus, all right, he had them put the blood of a lamb on their door frames when he was going to send his angel through the land to kill the firstborn. This was the 10th plague of Egypt, all right? And as long as they had the blood of a lamb on their door frame, then that angel would skip over or, what's the word I'm looking for? Pass over their house, all right? You like that one too? The jokes are just coming tonight, aren't they? Pass over their house so that their firstborn would be spared. All right. Now, the other thing that God wanted them to commemorate this, and one of the ways he told them to commemorate this was through what was known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, Unleavened bread is bread that's made without yeast. And the significance of that is if you make it without yeast, you don't have to wait for it to rise. And if you don't have to wait for it to rise, it gets done quicker. And this is meant to symbolize the haste with which they had to leave Egypt. That was the point. And if you remember what actually happened, once Pharaoh said, let them go after the 10th plague, was he just perfectly fine with it from that point on and said, no, what did he do? He chased him, right? So this is why God was telling them, Pharaoh's going to say, let you go, but you got to get out quickly, because he knew that Pharaoh was going to change his mind, all right? So that's what the Feast of Unleavened Bread was meant to commemorate. Now, what happened traditionally is they were supposed to commemorate the Passover originally on one day, and then it was immediately followed by a 7-day celebration for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But over time, what happened is because these were two holidays that kind of were literally right next to each other, they got absorbed into each other. And it ended up being a week-long celebration, which was sometimes called just Passover, or sometimes it's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but incorporated both of them. The first day they'd celebrate the Passover, and then they would do the Feast of Unleavened Bread over the rest of the week. All right, that's the situation at the time Jesus was on earth. All right, is that they had been combined into this 1 week-long kind of celebration. All right, now understanding that, let's take a look at the issue of the way that the Gospels, or the different Gospels, refer to this. Now, the other thing you need to understand is, if you look on the screen, I have a very cute little, it looks like jelly is smeared on that door frame, but I didn't want to get too graphic, and that's a picture of some unleavened bread. But I also have a picture of a weekly calendar. Now, on top, what you see is our weekly calendar, and the way we refer to it: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. All right? Below, you see the Jewish calendar. Now, the reason that is slightly offset is because the way the Jews would interpret the start of a day, their day started at sundown, typically about 6 p.m., all right? And so when they are referring to a day, they're referring to it from 6 p.m. one day till 6 p.m. the following day, not midnight to midnight like we do. So their days actually start about 6 hours before our days. So you can see that Jewish calendar I have below, it's offset. I don't know if it's exactly 6 hours. Someone wants to get a ruler, you can measure, but that's the point, is it's slightly offset. That's going to be significant as we work our way through this class and some of these contradictions here tonight. All right. So let's take a look at these Bible passages. We're going to start out by looking at Matthew and Luke, all right, and how they describe the Last Supper. Now, they're not talking about when they actually describe the crucifixion, but of course, if you could pinpoint some of these events, you can then extrapolate to the rest of them. All right. So let's take a look at how Matthew and Luke describe the Last Supper having taken place. Matthew says in 26:17, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" All right. And Luke, then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." All right. So, understand that their holiday, all right, well, let me ask this. In relation to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that 7-day celebration I said they would have, which day are they saying the Last Supper happened on? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7? Let's look at Matthew. What's he say?
First day.
The first day, right? So it's the first day. Both of them are agreeing. It's the first day of this 7-day unleavened bread celebration, all right? Now, for them, or that would be on, I'm going to mispronounce it, I'm sure, Shishi, all right? Which for us is that day that begins 6 o'clock on Thursday and runs through 6 o'clock on Friday. All right. So lots of times you'll hear, well, the first day of or when they celebrate the Passover, or the first day of the Festival of Unleavened Bread would have been on Friday. Well, that's as close as we can get it in our common parlance, but really it starts Thursday at 6 p.m. So if this is an evening meal, that's why we celebrate the Last Supper on Thursday night. All right. But as far as a Jewish reckoning is concerned, that's already the same day that's going to run into Friday, but it started Thursday night. All right. For us, it's Thursday. For them, it's Friday. We'll call it. All right. Now, if that is when the Last Supper was, then you can see that puts the crucifixion on Friday for us, right? Now, for them, it's still later the same day because it's not before 6 p.m. the following day. But for us, Last Supper Thursday night, crucifixion on Friday. All right, knowing that. So that's according to Matthew and Luke. Now let's take a look at how John describes it. All right, now John doesn't pinpoint the Last Supper. What John pinpoints, however, is the trial before Pontius Pilate. All right, and here's what John says. John says, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. All right, if the Passover refers to the first day of the celebration, all right, what we just saw from that previous slide would have been that for us, the Thursday going into Friday, all right? That's the first day. Then when does this seem to say, according to John, that Jesus was being tried before Pilate?
Wednesday.
It's the day in preparation, right? So this seems to suggest that in the Jewish calendar, it would be that day Shamishi. Again, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, and I apologize for that. The day before the first day of the celebration, which is Shishi, or Shai, all right, which for us would put it on Thursday that he's actually being tried before Pilate, which would then also mean that that's the day of his crucifixion, right? Because he goes from Pilate to being crucified. So that would put the crucifixion on Thursday. Well, which one is it? All right. This would appear to put the crucifixion on Thursday. So is this a contradiction between two of the Gospels indicating the crucifixion would have been on Friday and one of them indicating it would have been on Thursday? I'm just out of curiosity, has anybody ever heard this objection before? This is one that you really need to start putting the pieces of the puzzle together before you actually see. So it's not as common as the Judas dying one, but you might come across it, so I wanted to point it out. All right. Well,
That question.
yeah.
So is it possible that by the time he got up on the cross, it was 6:20 p.m. on Shishi?
That would make it difficult when you're talking about passages about wanting to take his body down before the Sabbath. You know, and so you get into some issues. Of course, the Sabbath wouldn't have been until Saturday. That causes all sorts of other issues as well. It still wouldn't resolve the alleged contradiction, in other words. Yeah.
Thursday.
Well, if he was crucified on Thursday, then you've got the other Gospels saying they wanted to take his body down before the Sabbath, but the Sabbath wouldn't have been until Saturday. That wouldn't have been an issue. So you've still got, if at any point if he was in fact crucified on Thursday, then I think you've got an issue with reconciling John's Gospel with what Matthew and Luke have said.
No, but when was the Last Supper, I think?
Well, in this case, the Last Supper would have been on Wednesday night, if you believe this interpretation. Because it would have been on the
Thursday started.
6 p.m. Wednesday night. Their Chamishi would have started 6 p.m. on our Wednesday night.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So couldn't the preparation and the Passover be the same day? Because if the Passover didn't start till 6 o'clock, it says the date of the preparation. They could be preparing for it that same day and then starting it at 6 o'clock. No?
Well, I mean, that is kind of what they do, because you've got the day of preparation up till 6 o'clock, but then when you start out with that meal, which would be the Last Supper meal. And so traditionally that would have to be, you know, when 6 o'clock hits, you're moving into the meal time, so to speak, which still is going to cause us issues, because it still has him being tried before Pilate, arguably before they even would do the meal. But you're getting along the right track here, because there is more than one way. We're going to get to the context and everything, linguistic context, yeah.
When those women saw the stone roll away, that was on Sunday, right?
Well, I guess that depends on who you ask, doesn't it? Not if he was crucified on a Thursday.
You start with that and go backwards 3 days.
It depends on how you reckon the 3 days too. And again, in Jewish, that's not really wasn't part of this chapter, but traditionally the way that thought process goes is when Jesus says he's going to be in the ground for 3 days and 3 nights, again, that's a Jewish expression. Any part of a day was considered a day and would be expressed that way. So let's get into this. This is another one where you need to understand the context, and this is one where there's something in the language that we're not understanding. And actually, ironically, someone who speaks Greek today, a modern-day Greek, might see right through this and understand. If they were in this class, they might have the explanation right away, because the way there's a particular Greek term that has come to mean something today and is still used that way today, and it was even common back then. And that is the Greek term for preparation. And this is kind of where you're getting at, hinting at that. What's the deal with the preparation? What does that mean exactly? The Greek word for preparation, which again, I've already mispronounced two Hebrew words tonight. I'm not going to try to mispronounce that one. It's on page 70 or 96, and I think I've got it on a slide here as well. I do. Yeah, we're not going to keep going with that. All right, but that Greek word for preparation, typically, if you think about it, typically the Sabbath was on, well, for the most part, what we would call Saturday, right? And so typically the day of preparation, or the preparation day, would have been what? Friday, all right? So much so, because that happened every single week, that term, that Greek term for preparation, came to be synonymous with Friday, all right? And even to this day, that term means Friday, okay? And so what it's entirely, and as a matter of fact, we see that, I gave you an example here in Mark 15:42, where it says it was preparation day. And then Mark goes on to explain, that is the day before the Sabbath, all right? There's an example in Scripture where Mark himself is actually using that word preparation to refer to Friday. And so it doesn't necessarily mean, just because John talks about it was the day of preparation of the Passover, that doesn't mean necessarily it was the day before Passover, getting ready for Passover. It could very well mean it was the Friday of Passover week, all right? Which would then, of course, line it up perfectly. And that's the slide I have up there right now, right? It would line it up perfectly with what we actually see in the other Gospels. So if John is using that term to mean Friday, essentially, and not preparation per se, then it lines up perfectly. And what John is saying is it was the Friday of that 7-week Passover celebration, which is exactly when the other Gospels place it. All right? So this is another one where you might not even come across something like this, but if you do come across something like this, sometimes the answer is you need to understand the original languages. Let me ask you this question, and I've mentioned this a few times before, but if somebody raises this type of objection, and if it is something that might hinge on the original languages, and you don't know the original languages, how are you going to come up with those answers? Google. Not a bad, you're right. I mean, you can't always trust everything on the internet, unless it's something I've put on the internet. No, kidding. But no, you're right. There's a lot of resources out there that you can go to. You can also get yourself a good study Bible. You know, your study Bibles are going to have notes in there that are going to explain some of these things too. Yeah.
Another answer is, what day it is not nearly as important as the result of that with the resurrection.
That is true, but we're more speaking here to people who aren't even going to give you an audience as far as what the consequences and the impact of the resurrection was, because they can't get past this kind of stuff. And you're right. For we as Christians, I was just talking to Pastor Jay today about the Genesis account and the differences of opinions within the Christian church about whether it's a literal 6 days or a longer one. And we were talking about was, you know what, same kind of thing. We can have differences of opinion on that as far as whether it was literal 6 days, whether it was ages, periods, whatever it may be. But really, what's the major point of a Genesis account? It's not how God made, it's that God made. And that's the point that we all agree on. And so we should be able to be a unified body of Christ and unify around that principle. And then still have those important discussions, because we do want to know what God's word says. And so we absolutely should have those discussions. But we should be able to have them with an air of gentleness and respect as long as we focus on, we all agree on this. All right, and this is what really the major point of the passage is. All right. So let's move on to another objection. We talked about a problem with people have as far as what day Jesus was crucified on. Well, what about what time Jesus was crucified? This is going to be a fun one, because we're going to read these two passages, and believe it or not, you already have the tools, based just on what we've talked about tonight, to figure this one out. All right? So let's see if you can do a little bit of detective work. All right, here's what it says in Mark. Mark says it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. All right? And then we get to John. All right, but again, in John, he's not talking about the crucifixion per se, he's talking about the trial before Pilate. Well, was Jesus tried before Pilate, before or after he was crucified? Yeah, okay, thank you. I was wondering if I was getting an answer on that one or just the laughter. That was a silly question. It'd be a really short trial. Well, frankly, Jesus didn't say much anyway, did he? But he would have said even less if he was dead already. So, yes, clearly the trial had to happen before he was actually crucified. But according to Mark, he was crucified in the 3rd hour. So what does John say? Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. We already went over that passage. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. All right? So, go ahead. Solve it. Does this seem to indicate that Jesus' trial before Pilate was 3 hours after he was crucified? Yeah.
Say the third hour of my day.
Okay, but then you're going to solve that by saying, really throwing the whole calendar out of whack. Was he tried before Pilate a whole day before he was crucified? I'll give you a hint. Let's see. Let's go back to that one.
Well, does the 6 o'clock, when the day start, actually equal the 1st hour?
Yes. 6 o'clock, according to the Jewish calendar, would be the 1st hour. However, it would still also kind of start over, just like we do AM, PM. So you'd be 6 o'clock in the evening would be the 1st hour of the evening, and then 6 a.m. would start the 1st hour of the morning, according to the Jewish calendar. According to the Jewish calendar. I'm going to say that another time.
It says it was the day of the preparation.
Yes, but we're still talking about the hours. Any other ways of telling time? Yeah, John was not writing he was not primarily concerned with Jews, okay? John's using the Roman calendar, way of telling time, which, by the way, is the same way we do, okay? Starts at midnight, goes to midnight. All right, let me get back up to the right slide here. All right. Oh, we did all that already. I'm skipping way ahead here. All right. So this is the idea. The idea is if the crucifixion was the 3rd hour and the trial before Pontius Pilate was the 6th hour, how could the trial before Pilate be after the crucifixion? And if we look at our calendar and we start to take into account the different ways they tell time, we realize that there is no contradiction after all. Like I said, the Jewish calendar started at sundown, about 6 p.m., and it would start over again to kind of like AM, PM we have. So it'd be the 1st hour in the evening, 1st hour in the morning. So it started about 6 a.m. would be the 1st hour of the morning, according to the Jewish calendar. So if Mark is using the Jewish calendar, all right, then what time would be the 3rd hour, according to the Jewish calendar, if the Jewish starts at 6 a.m.? 9 a.m. Okay. So if John is using the Roman calendar and it starts at midnight, when is the 6th hour according to the Roman calendar?
6 a.m.
Is 6 a.m. before 9 a.m.? Problem solved. All right? Again, you just got to understand the context and who they're actually writing to. All right? When John wrote his gospel, he was in Ephesus, the Roman capital of the province of Asia, all right? He was surrounded by a Roman context and writing in a Roman context. It was the last of the gospels that was written. That was not true of Mark, who wrote much earlier, all right? So for John, he's writing in a Roman context and using the Roman clock, all right? The other thing...
Wait a minute, are you saying that when Mark wrote that, he said the 3rd hour?
Mark was using the Jewish calendar.
But then doesn't the day start the night before?
The day, but it's like AMP, 3rd hour of the morning, all right, is essentially what he's saying.
Okay.
Well, because of the overall context, because of the other things he narrates. I mean, keep in mind, Mark also is the one talking about, we just talked about putting the Last Supper on Thursday night, and this is actually obviously after the Last Supper. He couldn't be referring to the 3rd hour of the evening because he's already narrated other events that were going on at the 3rd hour of the evening, between the Last Supper and the Gethsemane and the trials and all that. All that stuff has to take place before this takes place. So we know from, again, looking at the surrounding context, that he must be referring to the 3rd hour of the morning.
It would be what?
9 a.m. by our clock.
Okay, so their stuff, they start their day at 6 a.m.
Well, they start their, it's kind of like our 12 noon, okay? If you think about it, not the military time, but if you look at our, we have 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock or in the morning, then at 12 noon we start over again. Same thing. So you're going to have first hour of the evening, second hour of the evening, third hour of the evening, and then when you get to 6 a.m., you start over again, all right? So it'd be third hour of the morning would be 9 a.m.
So Mark was talking about the third hour of the second half of the day.
According to the Jewish calendar, yes. And you know that because of the overall context of the things he's already narrated.
That's 9 a.m. then, right?
Correct.
Now, what about the John? The sixth hour would then be 6 p.m.?
No, because John, again, you look at the surrounding context, and John goes on to narrate things like the crucifixion and everything that happened afterwards, so he couldn't be referring to the evening.
He's talking about
6 a.m.
6 a.m.
Right.
So 9 a.m. Jewish comes before 6 a.m. Roman.
No, it comes after 6 a.m. Roman. So you've got 6 a.m. Roman, the sixth hour Roman time is the trial before Pontius Pilate. That's what John illustrates. And the third hour Jewish time is our 9 a.m., which would be when the crucifixion happened. All right? All right.
I mean, really, how do people determine which calendar, which time system was used?
Who you're speaking to. I mean, it's kind of like if you were on a military base right now, all right, and you talked about 0600, would there be any confusion what you're talking about? All right? Because in that context, that's how they're used to having time told to them. And yet, if I tell you that our class, if I came to you last week and said, all right, everybody, don't forget, class next week starts at 7 o'clock, do I have to say p.m. for you to know I'm not referring to 7 o'clock in the morning? None of you showed up at 7 a.m. this morning. I don't think so. If you thought the church would have been locked if it was, all right? You all knew through the context that I was referring to to 7 o'clock p.m. And the same is true here.
Okay, but then, did John always write using Roman time, just when he was in Rome?
I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know. He wasn't in Rome. He was in a Roman province. But I don't know. I'd have to go back and look to see if he gave specific times for other events. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not, let me put it this way, I'm certainly not aware of any times when John in his gospel utilized the Jewish time. And I don't think there's anything else he actually gave a specific time to.
So I guess I have to make this go right in my head.
Yeah.
So if I'm in England on vacation, I'm using English time, so I'm 5 or 6 hours depending where I am.
Right.
Ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So when he was in a Roman province, he was using their time.
No, he wasn't. Okay, it wasn't like a time. It wasn't like a time zone thing. It's not like he was saying, well, when Jesus died at this certain time, it would have been, when Jesus died at 9 a.m. in Israel, it would have been 12 noon here, or something like that.
No, but in my head,
It's more just like speaking the language. All right, it's more like a better parallel would be if someone was in Italy and they were speaking Italian versus being in America and they were speaking English. All right, that's more like it. He's in that culture. He's communicating to them the way they would communicate time, so they'd understand what he's saying.
was he writing to the Gentiles, or was he?
Yes, largely. Yes.
But you said in here on page 98, when John wrote his gospel, though he was in Ephesus, the Roman capital of the province of Asia, he was surrounded by a Roman context and wasn't as concerned.
The Jewish timetable wouldn't have been his concern, right? Because what I'm saying is when John wrote his gospel, he was in a Roman setting. He's writing to a Roman audience, all right? So he's not going to care about how Jews would have told time at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, because if he did, his intended audience wouldn't have understood what he was saying. And so he's communicating it to them, just like nowadays, great parallel nowadays when we talk about how Jesus died, we talk about, even right now we're talking about 6 a.m., 9 a.m., all that. We're translating the way these Gospels are written into times that you all will understand, all right? The same thing that John was doing.
It's kind of interesting, churches ring bells at 6 and 12 and 6.
Yeah.
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 Coordinating all that together.
In Mark, he's saying he was crucified in the third hour.
The third hour.
John is not saying he was crucified in the third hour.
No, he's saying he was tried before Pilate in the 6th hour.
Pilate said, behold your king.
Correct.
So that could have been like the day before when
Well, he wasn't before Pilate. That's the thing. You look at the overall context, though, he wasn't before Pilate the day before. Pilate said crucify him, and they crucified him. And so there wasn't a whole day of space in between here.
When Pilate said, behold your king, he wasn't crucified yet.
No, but that's why the 6th hour, and I know this is confusing, we're almost getting into a math problem here, I know. That's why when we hear about the 6th hour in Roman time, that has to be referring to something before the 3rd hour in Jewish time, because when we hear the 3rd hour Jewish time, we're hearing that's when Jesus died. And he obviously couldn't be tried.
It doesn't have to be the same day.
Well, it kind of does when you take into account all the other events. In other words, when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, keep in mind, we're just looking at this in isolation. If this was the only issue to resolve, you're right, it doesn't have to be the same day. But when you take into account, you also have to fit in the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane and the trial before the Sanhedrin and before Herod and Pilate and all of those things, and they all have to happen before the Sabbath. And we know that they all started on Thursday night, based on what we just talked about before. You've got a limited window to fit this whole narrative between Thursday night before the Sabbath, Friday night. Friday 6 p.m. is when the Sabbath begins, all right? So you've got a 24-hour period that you've got to fit all these things into in order for it all to make sense. So that's how you know, surrounding context. All right. And that's a fun one, isn't it? Sorry, I had to think. That's one that you have to put your thinking cap on. It gets very confusing, but it's very different than very similar to when you're talking about translating things from one language to another. You've got to understand the cultural context sometimes in order to know what people are talking about. All right, let's get to something that's a little bit easier to understand. All right, what did the inscription on the cross say? All right. All 4 Gospels agree that Pontius Pilate had a sign placed on the cross. All right. However, when they're describing what was written on that sign, all 4 Gospels say something a little bit different. What you see, for example, on the screen, I have what the Gospels all say was written on the sign. Matthew 27:37 says it said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Mark 15:26 says it said, "The King of the Jews." Luke 23:38 says the sign said, "This is the King of the Jews." John 19:19 says, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." So they all have different versions of what the actual sign said. Now, before we get into the harmonization, if you want to call it that, of these 4 Gospels, let's remember what we talked about last week, the very first thing we talked about last week. And we're looking at this from the view of a skeptic who's using this as an objection, a reason to say, the Gospels can't agree, they're all contradicting each other. Just purely from a historical standpoint, what did we learn in that Titanic example? Remember the Titanic example from Frank Turek I talked about last week? What did we learn from that?
It doesn't matter how it happened, just that it's on.
Yeah, the details can be just the people. Even eyewitnesses can disagree about some of the specific details. But what you look for is a common core. And you had eyewitnesses who said the Titanic split in half. You had other eyewitnesses that said it didn't. But they all agreed upon one thing: it sank. So you're not going to be able to take the fact that some of them say it broke apart and others say it didn't, and from that conclude, well, then I guess the Titanic never sank. All right. So is there a common core between all 4 of these that they all agree upon? And if so, what is it?
King of the Jews.
King of the Jews. All right, so if nothing else, before we go any further, I think we would be historically justified in saying that sign at least identified him as the King of the Jews, because you have 4 separate eyewitnesses or gospel authors learning directly from eyewitnesses who agree that that's what the sign said. All right. Now, how do we resolve this difference between the other differences, other than the King of the Jews portion? Well, some people, if you look to John 19:20, which says that the sign was written in different languages and suggests that maybe it said something different in each language. I don't think that's even necessary, to be honest. We don't have to go there. Again, if we understand the context of the time and the literary styles of the time. Does anybody know, in the Greek as it was written at the time of these Gospels, about how they would denote punctuation? They didn't use it. Right, very good. There was no punctuation. They didn't have it. And so every time you open your Bible in the New Testament, and, well, the Old Testament too, really, but we're talking about the New Testament right now, and you see quotation marks, guess what? They weren't there in the original. That's something that the Bible translator is putting in there to try to, bring it into the way we write nowadays, but it's not in the original. And so a lot of people will say, well, one gospel quotes Jesus as saying X, Y, Z. The other one quotes him as saying Z, Y, X. Well, no, neither one quotes him as saying anything because there's no such thing as quotes, all right? They're giving you the gist of what he said. Not only that, I think this is later in the chapter, but I'll go ahead and say it now. Was Jesus speaking in Greek? No. Anybody know what language he likely was speaking in? Aramaic, most likely. Maybe Hebrew. But he wasn't speaking in Greek. So the Gospels are written in a language different from what he was speaking in. So they can't directly quote Jesus. Because literally, whatever words they're writing down are right off the bat, they're in a different language than what he was actually speaking, all right? Which tells us that whenever we see things about, any kind of quotations in the Gospels, then those are not meant to be direct quotations. They're meant to be paraphrases, meant to be getting the gist. And the gist, certainly, of these four is roughly the same. That being said, let's see. Yeah, the example I used in the book was, let's say that I just met with Pastor Jay, kind of like I did today. And after I met Pastor Jay, I went down the hall to my wife's office, which I also did today, ironically. The rest of the story did not actually happen today. But and I go down, I talk to my wife, and she asked me, well, what were you meeting with Pastor Jay about? What did Pastor Jay say? And I said, well, Pastor Jay said that there's a baptism at the 9 o'clock service this week, and he really wants to make sure that we have somebody filming it for that. Now, the fact that I said that, if somebody were to have actually recorded Pastor Jay, all right, and the exact words he used were not the exact words I relayed to my wife, does that mean I lied to my wife? No.
The mood of your wife.
What's that?
Depends on how your wife feels.
This is on video. She's going to kill you later, Bill. I'm just saying.
The first time.
All right, so... No, the point is, we all understand, even in our everyday language, that we paraphrase and think to get the gist across. The same thing is true here, especially when we know there were no quotation marks in it. If we don't have a problem with that in our language today, why are we objecting to it when we see it in the Bible? Why do we get the right to do something? We're going to try to deny that right to authors 2,000 years ago. But even more than that, let's take it even a step further. All right, knowing that each author was trying to give the gist to us, even if we assume that they were providing quotations. All right, does that mean there's a contradiction here? Well, let's look at this example. Let's pretend that you have 4 pieces of paper, and you are told that each piece of paper contains part of the original message, all right, but not all of it. And what you see on the screen is what is included on each one of those pieces of paper. Can somebody please, from that, reconstruct for me what the original said?
Yes. Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, and you're glad I didn't sing it.
Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. You could sing it. I mean...
Well, and you could also say, Mary had a fleece from a lamb that was white as snow.
Well, does that grammatically make sense? Well, you're right. Even if you rearrange the order, still communicating the same message. And when we're talking about it being just communicating the gist, it doesn't make a lick of a difference. But you still look at what's the most grammatically likely, so to speak. Well, let's take that same principle now and look at those 4 gospel accounts of what that sign said. And I've organized them for you the same way we just did that Mary had a little lamb example. And based on that, they might not have even been trying to provide direct quotes. All I'm illustrating here is even if they were trying to provide quotes, and at least quoting part of what was on that sign, would you be able to deduce what that sign likely said? What did it likely say?
Jesus was the king of the hills.
Yeah. What's the whole message? Yeah. Right. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Was likely, if they were trying to provide a direct quote, is likely what the full thing said. No matter how you look at it, we can look at it multiple different ways here, and there's not a contradiction here. What we have are complementary accounts, not contradictory accounts. All right? All right. See, that was easier than that whole 3rd hour, 6th hour thing, right? Yeah.
Is it fact? There's a baptism on August 2nd.
No, there's not really a baptism at 9 o'clock.
Oh, no, really.
You didn't get it.
Freaking Gene out here. So, no. I forgot that was part of Gene's job. I'm scaring her here in the front row. All right. Another common objection that's raised is in regard to the thieves on the cross. And it's did both thieves revile Jesus or only one? And we see in Matthew chapter 27, verse 44, he says, in the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Yet if we look at Luke, in Luke's account, we read, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. All right. So my question, the suggestion here is, if you look at the Matthew account, it says rebels, plural, were heaping insults on him. And yet if we look at the Luke account, we've got one rebel heaping insults on him and one not. All right, so let's take a look at the same technique we've been using over the last few chapters here, the last two chapters. Number one, is there a difference between these two accounts?
No.
And no differences whatsoever?
Yeah.
Well, what differences are there? Not contradictions necessarily, we'll get to that next, but is there a difference?
One says both of them, one says just one.
One says both, one says just one. All right. Is that difference now necessarily a contradiction? And can you think of a way to resolve that those could be harmonized?
No contradiction.
It says they did it, but it doesn't say both did it.
Well, the first one seems to say that they both. Now, let me ask you this. Is there a way, is it possible that both thieves could have insulted Jesus, and then also one thief insulted Jesus, and another one said, you shouldn't be doing that? How is that possible?
Because Jesus said some things too.
Yeah, different times. And so what was that?
I say Jesus said some things too, which could make him change.
Which could make him change his mind, right? And the example that I proposed in the book was, Jesus, it's entirely possible. They were both heaping insults on Jesus, and then one of them hears Jesus talk about, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. I mean, think about that for a second. If anybody understands what Jesus was going through, it was the other thieves on that cross. And knowing that and feeling that pain and understanding what he was experiencing and still seeing him say, forgive the people that did this to me. I mean, that's got to have a powerful impact on you. And so it's entirely possible they both did start out by insulting Jesus. And then one of them changed his mind, perhaps because of that what he saw Jesus doing there, and turned around and said, no, we shouldn't be doing this anymore. Shut up.
And the thieves had, they had ropes. They didn't have the nails put in their hand.
That's one version. I mean, the Bible doesn't say, but you're right. Some people say the thieves had ropes, not nails, and Jesus had nails, which means they would have known that his experience was even worse than theirs. Right. Absolutely. All right. It's kind of an example I gave in the book of this. Another example I gave. Suppose I was working late one night, and my wife and daughter called me up to tell me to come home. Well, they're not going to do that tonight because they're both here downstairs, but they're working too. But let's suppose they were at home, and they both called me up and said, Ken, you need to get home. And then I'm walking out the door, and you catch me, and you ask me, hey, are you burning the midnight oil? I was wondering when you were going to get out of here. And I say, yeah, my wife just called me and told me to come home. Does the fact that I didn't tell you my daughter also was on the phone at the time mean that I've lied to you? No. I've just chosen to focus on one particular aspect of it, in this case, the fact that my wife. And why? Who knows? Maybe because you know my wife, but you don't know my daughter. All right, that may be one reason why. But just because I've chosen to include some piece of information and not include some other piece of information doesn't mean it's a contradiction there. It's just a matter of emphasis. So just because one gospel mentions both of the thieves started out by insulting Jesus and doesn't mention, for example, that one of them came around and changed his mind, doesn't mean that there's a contradiction. All right, that's not a logical contradiction there. It could just mean that they're choosing to emphasize this because this is more what the point that they're trying to make with their particular narrative. We talked about that a little bit last week as well. All right, moving on. We've got about 30 minutes left to see if we can get through these. We got a lot of fun stuff. We're still on Jesus dying here. We got to get to him being resurrected. So what did the centurion say at the cross? This is another one where we look at the different gospel accounts and we see supposedly different versions of what was actually said. Matthew chapter 27, verse 54, has the centurion saying, surely he was the Son of God. Mark 15:39 has him saying, surely this man was the Son of God. And Luke 23:47 has him saying, surely this was a righteous man. All right. First of all, based on what we just learned about punctuation, what's the first thing that should cross your mind when you look at this alleged contradiction? They're not real quotes, right? These are not direct quotes. And is it arguable that these are all three paraphrasing the same basic thought? Sure. I mean, they could argue. As a matter of fact, I will tell you that the difference between Matthew and Mark is there is no difference between Matthew and Mark. I mean, you've got, anybody ever speak, I know there's other languages that do this too, but I learned Spanish when I was a kid. Anybody know Spanish? And how you have different, you have feminine and masculine versions of words in Spanish, right? The same is true of Greek. And so when Mark there actually uses surely this, really if you want to do a word-for-word translation, might be surely this was the Son of God, but he uses the masculine form of the word, and so that's why we translate it, surely this man was the Son of God. But certainly you can see, especially considering those are translations of whatever he said likely in Aramaic, the centurion wasn't necessarily speaking Greek when he said this, that those certainly could be paraphrases of the same word. Some people will look at Luke and say, when he says, surely this was a righteous man, no, that's a different thought. That can't be a paraphrase. Well, first of all, if he was the Son of God, was he a righteous man?
Yes.
I would like to think so, all right? So I do think that those could just be paraphrases of the same thing. And the other thing, I don't know if you remember or not, we talked about Luke, who was writing primarily to a Greek audience, and one of his recurring themes throughout his gospel was this, one of the things he was touching on, I should say, was this Greek philosophical thought of the quest for the perfect man, all right? That was a very common pursuit in Greek. I'm sorry?
He was a doctor, so he was more into the physical.
Yes, that's true. He was a doctor, so you could expect that from him. And he was like I say, he was all speaking to a Greek audience, so he's trying to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of what you're looking for, and so he's going to focus on that theme that you see in Greek philosophy as well. Yeah. All right. I teased you at the end of last week's class with this particular question. And now we're finally past all the death stuff. Let's get to the happy resurrection stuff, shall we? How many angels were at the tomb? 2, right. Okay, moving on to the next question. All right, no. That's the short answer, but let's take a look at why people think this is an issue. Matthew 28, verse 5 says, the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. Whereas John chapter 20, verses 11 and 12 says, now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels. So, same procedure. Is there a difference?
Just because it said the angel doesn't mean there wasn't another one.
Correct. Just because it says the angel said this doesn't mean there wasn't an angel there as well. We get back into what was the author's chosen emphasis. If you look at the Matthew passage, Matthew was clearly trying to focus on the angel who was speaking. Whereas if you look at John, John was focusing on what Mary saw. Okay? One's focus is on the angel who was speaking, what the angel said. The other's priority was what Mary was seeing with her eyes. And what Mary was seeing with her eyes was 2 angels, all right? Just because only one of them spoke and Matthew only relays one of them that spoke doesn't mean there wasn't another one there. Exactly. All right. Next one. Was it light or still dark out when the women visited the tomb? All right, so this is one where we look at Mark and John. And Mark chapter 16, verse 2 says this. It says, very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. So what time is Mark saying this happened?
Doesn't say, they're on the way to the tomb.
They're on their way to the tomb, but it gives us some kind of time reference. What was it? Just after sunrise. All right, so after sunrise would indicate the sun is at least in the process of coming up over the horizon, right? All right, what about John? John 20, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance.
Maybe she left in the dark, but it was light by the time she got there.
There you go. See, this is great. You know why this is great? Because we're in week 6, and this is actually what I would hope for in week 6, that you would start to be able to see these resolutions yourself. Exactly. When I say I went to work this morning, Or, hey, when I went to work this morning, it was still dark out. Does that mean that the sun wasn't up by the time I got to work? No.
Not if you stopped at the 7-Eleven.
Actually, I usually stop at Royal Farms, not 7-Eleven, but thanks. So clearly, it's entirely possible that it was dark out when they left to go to the tomb. And then, even if you look at Mark, what does Mark say? Mark doesn't say that when they arrived at the tomb, when they left for the tomb, what does he say? They were on their way when it was just after sunrise. All right? So that seems to suggest, yes, it was not yet sunrise when they left. It was dark. And then while they were on their way, the sunrise happens. All right? Exactly. So there is no contradiction there. All right. How about another one? Did they tell anybody? All right. This is a little bit more complicated. Chapter 16, verse 8 of Mark says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Matthew 28, verse 8, however, says, so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, they agree on that, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. So the question is then, did they tell anyone or not? Matthew seems to suggest they went to tell the disciples. Mark seems to suggest they were too afraid to tell anybody. Is there a contradiction? Or is there a difference? Yes, I just told you what it was. I won't ask you that question. Is there a contradiction? Yeah.
Mark doesn't tell the whole story. Because how long were they afraid and how long did they keep silent?
How long did they keep silent? Right. And here's the other thing. Remember one of the things we've learned about, and I've somewhat got it slanted against you here because I'm only showing you these verses. And the reason I'm doing this is because this is lots of times when a skeptic or somebody brings this up to you, this is what they're going to do. They're just going to show you the isolated verses. All right, they're not going to want you to look around them. Let's take a look at Mark, the verse immediately before this one, where he says they were so afraid they didn't tell anybody. All right, right beforehand, we have the angel instructing the women, but go, tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Are we really to believe that Mark is trying to communicate to us in one verse that the angel specifically told the women to go tell the disciples, and the next verse trying to tell us that they directly disobeyed? Not likely. This gets to what Bill was saying, that it doesn't say how long they were terrified, how long they stayed silent. It may very well just mean they didn't tell anyone else along the way to the disciples.
Maybe they didn't see anyone.
What's that?
Maybe they didn't see anyone.
Maybe they didn't see anyone. Maybe they did and they were, just because they were told to tell the disciples. They were myopically focused. I'm going to the disciples. That's what I was told to do. That's what I'm going to do. But regardless, it doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think it's fair to interpret Mark's 8th verse as saying they literally never told a single soul for the rest of their lives, because it doesn't say that, and it doesn't seem to fit with what he just said in verse 7.
Also, women had no, they were like cattle, so nobody's going to believe them anyway.
And that could be part of what they were afraid of. Nobody's going to believe them anyway, so why are they going to stop along the road and tell people they just saw Jesus risen from the dead, or the angels just told them, rather, that Jesus was risen from the dead, because nobody's going to believe them anyway, and they're going to get locked up. People are going to think they're nuts. They're going to go to the disciples, who might be a more receptive audience, because they actually learned from Jesus and should have seen this coming. All right. Yeah.
This is going to show my ignorance here, but what happened to the guards that were there?
They were... I'm trying to remember how the Gospels actually describe it. My understanding, and I have to go back to make sure, is that they were... I know afterwards the Gospel says that they were told to relay the story that the body was stolen while they were asleep, and if the word got back, that they would make sure they didn't get in trouble for that.
They would have been executed.
They would have been executed if they'd done that. So I don't know, and I don't want to speak out of turn and be incorrect, whether any of the Gospels specifically say they were knocked out on the ground or anything like that. They mentioned the stone was rolled away. I don't know if they mentioned, and the guards' bodies were all strewn across there. I don't know if they specifically said. I have to go back and look at that. But clearly, my thought process is it's probably just like we kind of portray it in our Passion play, where they were knocked out, because that would make more sense of the explanation, say the body was stolen while you were asleep, and we'll make sure that you're protected if that happens. Yeah.
Well, wouldn't whatever rolled the stone away have affected them too?
Well, it was the angel that rolled the stone away. We'll get to that in a minute. The Bible does say that.
That's sort of like a event.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, the other possibility is they weren't knocked out. They saw an angel come roll a stone away, and they went, ah, and they ran away. I mean, that'd be pretty, you like that? So this is why I direct the plays. I don't get on stage and act anymore. No, I'm kidding. I'm actually a pretty decent actor. But anyway.
When they saw the gardener there too?
What's that?
The gardener was there?
The gardener episode is later. That's when Mary Magdalene, we'll see that in a second. That's when Mary Magdalene comes back a second time when she mistakes Jesus for the gardener, when Jesus is actually appearing to her. All right. Let's see. Sometimes I just get going and I lose track of where I actually was here. All right. So, this one, there's no way you're reading that on the screen. It's so small. If you have the book, I would suggest turning to page 108. All right. And what we're going to be talking about here is we've talked about a number of different specific examples. Now we're going to kind of look at big picture and say, can the differences in the gospel accounts of the resurrection be harmonized? There are some other differences. This chart on page 108 kind of breaks it all down for you so you can see where the gospels differ in what they describe. First question on there is, who came to the tomb first? Well, according to Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. According to Mark, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. According to Luke, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others. And John just says Mary Magdalene. What do they all have in common? Mary Magdalene was there, right? And if Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others, if they were there, does that also mean that Mary Magdalene was there? So there's no contradiction there, is there? But there's some differences. Another one there. What did they find when they got there? According to Matthew, it's an earthquake and an angel who rolled the stone away. Mark just says the stone rolled away. Luke says the stone rolled away. And John says the stone was removed from the entrance. We'll come back to some of these here in a second. I just want to finish going through the chart. Whom do they see at the tomb? Well, according to Matthew, they saw an angel sitting on the stone. According to Mark, they saw a young man in a white robe sitting on the right side. According to Luke, they saw two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning. And John doesn't mention anyone. And then you get to Matthew. Who was the next to go to the tomb? Matthew doesn't mention anybody else going to the tomb after that. That's kind of where he ends his narrative. Same with Mark. All right. Luke mentions Peter. John mentions Peter and the other disciple, which scholars generally agree is John himself. All right. Then later he relays another visit where Mary Magdalene returns and sees two angels in white sitting where Jesus' body had been, and then sees Jesus himself. And this is the gardener episode that you were talking about before. That's in the Gospel of John. All right. So you definitely see some differences here, but how many how many contradictions are there? Again, they could all be telling part of the story, and if we look at these, that's kind of what we start to see. For example, John does not mention the angels when Mary Magdalene first arrives at the tomb. Does that mean the angels weren't there? No. Just because he doesn't mention them doesn't mean that they weren't there. How about Matthew and Mark, who both end their story, all right, with the women, and they don't mention the later visits by Peter and John and Mary Magdalene. They don't even mention the fact that they came afterwards. It's the fact that they chose to end their version, their narrative, after the women left the tomb, mean that they are denying that anyone else came to the tomb. No, it just means that that's what they chose to focus on, all right? Moving on. Matthew, for example, he never mentions, if you look at Matthew, he mentions that there was an earthquake, how did he put it? And the question is, what did they find when they got there? He says, an earthquake and an angel who rolled the stone away. However, if you look at it in context, Matthew never actually says that happened after the women arrived. All right, he's just describing as part of his narrative, this is what happened. He very well could have been describing, this is to explain to you what they saw when they got there, this is what had just happened. All right, before they arrived, there had been an earthquake, the stone had been rolled away, so when they got there, there was a tomb with a stone not in front of it. All right, it's more like background information. What about, this is a fun one. I actually had somebody raise this objection to me at one point. Matthew says the angel was sitting on the stone, and Mark says the angel was sitting on the right side. Somebody raised this with me, really said that's a contradiction. Is that a contradiction? The stone was on the right side. How is that hard to, that's not exactly difficult to reconcile. Or, guess what? Even if the stone was on the left side, Angels' feet weren't nailed to the floor. They could move. It's possible the angel was sitting on the stone and then moved to the right side. I mean,
Got some of them anyway.
and there's two angels, And so there's all sorts of ways you can resolve this. But sometimes people will work really hard to try to find a contradiction, so to speak. And that's another example of that one in there. All right. And the last one I'll mention, we kind of already touched on this one already, is Mary Magdalene's solo visit to the tomb. Some skeptics will look at the other three Gospels and say they never mentioned Mary Magdalene going back to the tomb. Or they never mentioned, for example, that they never mentioned the fact that Jesus actually appeared to Mary Magdalene when she was at the tomb. And this is because they're getting confused and not realizing that Mary Magdalene went twice. All right, she went first with the women, and that's what these skeptics do. Is that what they'll do is they'll take a look at John's gospel where it mentions Jesus actually appearing to Mary, that whole story, and they'll say, well, wait a minute, but the other gospels do mention Mary Magdalene going to the tomb, but they don't mention anything about her seeing Jesus while she was there. That's pretty significant. Well, except for the fact they're relaying two separate events. So Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb with the women. She goes back, she gets the disciples. The disciples run up, Peter and John run to the tomb with Mary Magdalene hot on the trail, so to speak. All right? And then it's after that, it's that time when she goes back, when Peter and John leave, and then Mary Magdalene is still there, then that's when she sees Jesus. All right? These aren't contradictions. They're just different authors telling different parts of the story. All right, putting the pieces of the puzzle together, you can get the unified whole. And again, I mentioned this briefly last week. The reason you know these aren't contradictions, let's imagine for a moment that there was only one gospel, all right? And that gospel took all of this harmonization that I'm talking about, and told it to you all in that order, all right? Would you be looking at that and saying, well, that doesn't make sense? No, it would make perfect sense. It'd be a perfect narrative, a perfect story from start to finish. And if that's the case, then there's nothing contradictory about it. Just because you have four different authors that each tell a part of that story doesn't somehow make it a contradiction, doesn't make it contradictory. All right? So, I want to wrap things up here by talking about, kind of hitting on what we've talked about for the past 2 weeks and then summing up what we've talked about for all 6. Remember what we talked about. If someone raises an objection saying that there's a contradiction in the Bible, the first thing you want to be looking at is, most of the time, a difference is not necessarily a contradiction. Lots of times these things are complementary, not contradictory, meaning they complement each other. They each include a piece of the total picture. All right? And remember the advice from the start of chapter 5. Another easy way to get this conversation started, if someone points out a difficulty to you, the first question you ask is, so what? So what? What do you think that proves? And this gets back to the Titanic example. If someone were to point out, well, some people said the Titanic split in half and some people say it didn't. So what? What do you think that proves? Tell me what you're asking me to conclude from that, and then, excuse me, and then we'll talk about whether that conclusion is really justified by that difference. And if they say, well, therefore, I want you to draw the conclusion that the Titanic never sank, whoa, hold on a minute. That doesn't, even if I assume that what you're saying really is a contradiction, that doesn't justify jumping to that conclusion. And that's what you see a lot of the times here. Just like the differences in the signs on the cross we looked at, for example. Even if we assume that's a contradiction, which we've already seen it's not, but even if we assume that it is, what are you asking me to prove? Well, then he didn't hang a sign over Jesus. Whoa, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense, because all 4 of them agree he hung a sign. And all 4 of them agree it said King of the Jews. So the first question is always, so what? What are you asking me to conclude from that? Because lots of times the conclusion they're asking you to come to is far greater than what is justified, even if it was a contradiction. And it's also a double standard. If we were to look at even if we were to assume that the Bible wasn't the inerrant word of God, it was just some other historical document, just like any other historical document, I've got news for you. No scholar demands that a historical writing be 100% accurate before we will believe anything it says. Remember the example I gave last week of Plutarch? And I talked about how he wrote these biographies of a number of Roman citizens. Guess what? Plutarch was also known for putting his own political spin into his writings quite a bit. Does that mean we throw everything Plutarch said out the window? No. But we can recognize that he's got this political spin and maybe be aware of it when we see it come up, but that doesn't mean that he's not giving us any accurate information that we can't conclude, especially if we see some of the things he's reporting also being reported by other people, that some of what he's giving is likely accurate. All right? So wrapping it all up, the whole spiel. We are 6 weeks in, and I like this quote. This is from the conclusion now, page 112 of the book. It's from A.W. Tozer, and he said this. He said, "Nothing less than a whole Bible can make a whole Christian." That's kind of my motivation why I decided I wanted to teach this class, why I decided I wanted to write this book, is because I think, unfortunately, the tendency a lot of Christians have when we come across difficult passages in the Bible is we just skip past them. We want to get to the parts that make us feel good, and we want to skip over the parts that we don't understand or that challenge us. And the problem is when you're doing that, not only are you ill-equipped when someone asks you questions about these things, but you're neglecting part of God's Word. If we sincerely believe as Christians that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, this is His letter to us, if you got written, picture someone in your mind right now, whoever is the person you love most or someone you love the most, all right? Maybe a child, maybe a relative, maybe a best friend, anyone, all right? And that person wrote you a letter, and you hadn't seen them in a long time, and they wrote you a really heartfelt letter. Are you telling me you'd skip paragraphs? No. So why would you do that with God's letter to you? You don't skip paragraphs. That's why I like this quote. Nothing less than a whole Bible can make a whole Christian. You want to be a whole Christian, you want to have a fully fulfilled Christian life and really feel and experience your faith, then don't neglect any parts of God's Word. We need to challenge ourselves, and there are answers out there. The Bible is not just one book, despite what a lot of people nowadays think. It's a collection of 66 books written by approximately 40 authors over a span of 1,500 years approximately. Given the number of different authors, the different settings, the different cultural contexts, the different times, of course we're going to expect to come across differences in emphasis, in style, and in context. We should expect that. This wasn't one book written by one author all at the same time. But when we come across those differences, what you need to do is work through those 6 basic principles. Start at the top, work your way down. See which ones actually apply to the situation that you're facing, and it might help guide you to whatever the resolution is. Get yourself a good study Bible. Get yourself a good, if you want to get a commentary, like I said, I really like the New American Commentary. That's a good one. Get a good Google. Amy's not even looking up at me. I'm using your joke. Come on. There are some good ministry resources out there. There's Reasons to Believe is a good one that's out there. Greg Kokel is Stand to Reason is his that's out there. That's a good one. Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. And there's a number of good books out there on Bible difficulties. The Big Book of Bible Difficulties is one. There's mentioned in the conclusion that you can get, if you're having trouble, you come across the passage that you're struggling with and you're not quite sure how to apply the basic principles, get yourself some resources on that as well. But most importantly, pray. I mean, the God's promised to send us the Holy Spirit. And so lots of times I think the reason we have these difficulties with these passages is because we're trying to do it all on our own. Don't try to do it all on your own. I mean, seriously, if you got God there to help you out, why would you try to do it on your own, right? So beforehand, pray, ask for guidance, ask for God's help, and God's going to help you work your way through these things. If you have any other questions, you've all got my email address. But of course, Bill's not going to wait for that. He's got a question right now. Hey, Bill.
In practice, when you shoot down somebody's contradictory view of the gospel differences, what's the typical reaction you get from the people that are contradictory?
Depends who I'm talking to and how reasonable they are. I did have last week I mentioned a gentleman who was the son of a lady who I communicate with relatively regularly online. She's not local. I know she's watching a lot of these videos, and she does ask me a lot of questions. And her son and I were talking about, I think the same thing I mentioned last week. Well, was it? Now maybe I'm confused. Maybe I'm apologizing. I might be confusing him with someone else, but I think it was him. We were talking about crucifixion, and I can't remember the exact objection that he raised, but I mentioned that there was Josephus, a Roman historian, who had pointed out that even though ordinarily Romans would leave bodies upon a cross after they died to rot, that the Jews were given special dispensation, so to speak, to take them down before the Sabbath. And this wasn't something, because he had objected, I guess the objection was, well, that wouldn't, Jesus wouldn't have actually been in the tomb because the Romans would have left his body on the cross. And I pointed out this non-Christian source that pointed out that that wasn't the case, that the Romans did allow the Jews to do this. And to his credit, he said, you know what, you're right. That's what it says. That's been one thing that I've used in my arsenal for a long time that I'm not going to be able to use anymore because that's out there. I will say that you tend to find more success when something like that, when I can point to a non-Christian source, as opposed to when you're trying to prove to them that they're just rejecting Christian sources just because they're Christian, which isn't historically viable either. You don't reject a Jewish historian, everything he says about Jews just because he's Jewish. Why are you going to reject a Christian source? And the other thing I point out to people sometimes when they try to say, well, you can't believe that the gospel writers, when they say that they saw Jesus risen from the dead, because they're all a bunch of Christians. And I said, what would you be if you saw Jesus rose from the dead? You know? I mean, seriously. I mean, the idea is, isn't that exactly what we would expect if what they're saying is true? So if they really saw Jesus rise from the dead after spending 3 years in ministry with him and they didn't become a Christian, I'd be worried about their mental health. All right, that would mean they wouldn't be a reliable source for information. So the mere fact that we have Christian authors relaying these historical events to us is not a reason to reject them outright. So, all right, any other questions? I thank you all very much. It's been a fun 6 weeks. If you were inclined to fill out a questionnaire, I appreciate that too. Just leave them on the table over here, or you can put them in my mailbox later. Thank you all. God bless.
Thank you.